Well, thank you very much for having me here today. It's a genuine privilege to be here at the RAF Club in Piccadilly, and thank you, Trevor. Thank you, Norman, and to whoever kindly suggested that we have a talk on C.S. Lewis today. I'm going to go fairly rapidly. I hope you find today's talk, the second talk, intellectually stimulating and morally stimulating. I'm going to go fairly rapidly, but it's sobering subject matter. And, recently we've been seeing the pictures of the D-Day footage, and we've been thinking about invasion, and sometimes I feel as if there's an invasion of the wrong sort that's coming our way, and it's not to liberate. My father served in the RAF. He was a teenager at the end of the war, and I can remember him telling me that in Salisbury, seeing the sky darkened with planes flying out across the English Channel. I think that C.S. Lewis is a powerful voice and gives us prophetic, prescient insight that helps us to understand the roots of what is going on today in education and schools. So, without further ado, quite a few slides for you. I will talk for about half an hour and then have a good exchange of views afterwards. So, the abolition of man. I'm going to be drawing upon the abolition of man, which was a series of lectures originally delivered here. It's now the University of Newcastle upon Tyne. It was Durham University then. And these are the lectures that C.S. Lewis gave about schooling, about secondary schooling. People often miss the subtitle, Reflections upon the Teaching of English with reference to the upper forms of schools. So he's especially looking at 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, not Oxford undergraduates, not Oxford English undergraduates, but children in schools, young people. First of all, C.S. Lewis says in The Abolition of Man that the task of the modern educator, is to irrigate deserts. Not, he says, to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. And what he meant by that was that as teachers inculcate just sentiments, as they inculcate just sentiments, we could say parents as well, any teacher of a child, that as they inculcate just sentiments and enable the moral sense of their students to thrive and to cultivate good character, that they are indeed irrigating deserts, enabling the moral sense of their students to thrive and to cultivate good character. And mere education, which just made it in time for the November anniversary last year of the 50th anniversary of the death of C.S. Lewis, mere education seeks to apply the thought of Lewis to current debates in education. The title, first of all, it's not simply to remind us of mere Christianity. Lewis was an expert, a world expert in medieval and Renaissance literature. And the title of this book is, the word mere is used in its Middle English sense, an adjective meaning pure, unadulterated, unalloyed, pure. There's another reason which I think is singularly appropriate for using the word mere, given the aim of education is irrigating deserts. A mere in England, not a lot of people know this, a mere in England isn't just Lake Windermere in the Lake District. Where does that word come from? A lot of people don't know that within the 8 acres where he lived at the Kilns in Oxford, there was a small mere where he used to go swimming. Sadly, it's now becoming silted up, and I will endeavour to avoid any muddiness today. But I want to suggest that at first, at least, we are seeing schooling through silted up 21st century or 20th century eyes. And I want to try to challenge many taken for granted and widely accepted and popular ideas of education and schooling that won't be popular in certain quarters, a bit like you, perhaps. So, I was recently driving through the Netherlands with a Dutch friend who pointed out that the road we were on was below sea level. He was telling me that some people live 6 to 10 metres under sea level. And if a dam bursts, if a dam fails, the land is overrun by the sea. Now, boundaries between the land and the sea are especially significant in the regions where Anglo-Saxon was once spoken. A mere in 21st century Germany is a sea. In the Netherlands, it's a lake. And what mere education is seeking to do is to provide a bulwark against the encroaching tide by helping us to attend to the foundations of education and schooling. And the first half of this talk is the foundations, and then we will apply it to current issues of pressing concern in education and schooling in the second half. So mere education is intended to help us set boundaries so that we can protect children, young people, schools and schooling from the incoming tide of ideological assumptions that threaten to erode and undermine the wholeness and purity of education as Lewis saw it. And there's another sense in which mere is appropriate. The sandy seabed, I have an old National Geographic magazine at home that shows the sandy seabed when they were draining some of these meres in the Netherlands. And the sandy seabed, once no longer exposed to air and to water, looks like a desert. The only way the desert can flourish is through extensive irrigation. So this afternoon, for the next 25 minutes or so, is about irrigating deserts, about the nature of the desert, why deserts should be irrigated, how they can be irrigated, and the results of such irrigation. For Lewis, the task of the modern educator is to irrigate deserts. The other reason for the photos on the front cover of the book, my wife and I, our children are there underneath C.S. Lewis. I want to introduce you to young Jeremy, and if my pen is working, I wouldn't have remembered this if it wasn't for our previous speaker. And this is young Luke, and this is young Lydia, and this is Jeremy. Pikelets, as they're affectionately known. So, right, here we go. So, Men Without Chests. The first chapter, the first part of The Abolition of Man, is entitled Men Without Chests, because he sees the results of current schooling leading to an atrophy of the chest. He says that each of us is more than a head, more than an animal with appetite or stomach, because we have a moral sense. We have a chest. And he thought that children were being educated for academic success, but scant attention was paid to moral and character education in schools. It's a grotesque and disturbing image. But what do many schools believe about virtue? Do they have the education of character as a priority? And what would be the basis for that? We had a very nice introduction to the Tao just now, C.S. Lewis's word for natural law. I had actually given about 4 talks on the Tao, and it wasn't until I got to Nanjing in China that some very nice Chinese people pointed it out to me because I've been saying Tao for the last sort of 4 or 5 lectures. We pronounce T's as D's. It's the Tao in Confucianism. So C.S. Lewis has recourse to natural law, otherwise known as moral law, as the basis for character and moral education. It is this concept, he says, whether Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoic, Christian or Oriental, that is referred to as the Tao. It is the way, it is the road, it is nature. So he sees a universal and an innate morality. You may remember this. I certainly hope you appreciate it. He asks us to imagine a completely different sort of morality, where a man felt proud of double-crossing all the people who had been kindest to him. He says nobody finds that sort of behaviour admirable wherever you go in the world. He says there's no sense in saying that a footballer has committed a foul unless there is some agreement about the rules of football. There's an innate and a shared sense of right and wrong. Memorably, he says the human mind has no more power of inventing a new value than of imagining a new primary colour, or indeed of creating a new sun and new sky for it to move in. The same indispensable platitudes will meet us in culture after culture. The Tao. And of course, in the New Testament, we have evidence of this universality of natural law in St. Paul's view, that those not belonging to the Judeo-Christian tradition show that what the law requires is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness. And I just want to read to you from St. Thomas Aquinas, from the Summa Theologica. He says first, he talks about primary and secondary precepts of natural law. First, there are certain most general precepts that are known to all, and secondly, certain secondary and more detailed precepts which are, as it were, conclusions following closely from the first principles. The secondary precepts of the natural law can be blotted out from the human heart either by evil persuasions or by vicious customs and corrupt habits and even unnatural vices. About the same time that Paul was writing this epistle, Cicero was declaring that there was a true law that was indeed unchangeable and eternal. Lewis uses terms like righteousness, correctness, order, truth to denote this. He says that it's like New York City. Whatever you happen to believe about it, it's there. It doesn't change the fact that it exists. It's a bit like saying to somebody that you don't agree with their law of gravity. So the Tao is a law in the sense that certain actions merit our approval or disapproval. That's a really important point. We recognize values. We do not choose them. We do not choose our own values. They have to be outside of ourselves to compel our allegiance. Elsewhere, Lewis writes about the sheet of music paper telling the piano keys the notes they play. It cannot be one of the keys themselves. Okay. It's the doctrine of objective value. the belief that certain attitudes are really true, that others are really false to the kind of thing the universe is and the kind of things we are, says Lewis. Okay, so now let's start applying that to education. He says, the educational problem is wholly different according as you stand within or without. For those within, the task is to train, shock, horror, training, to train in the pupil those responses which are in themselves appropriate, whether anyone is making them or not, and in making which the very nature of man consists. The whole educational problem is different as whether you stand within or without. But what has happened? Arguably, the educational community has bought into the idea that the traditional conception of knowledge is no longer valid, preferring to acknowledge a range of interpretations. Education is no longer understood in terms of training that enables us to pursue a true conception of reality. The problem is that the moment we see the moral law as a mere subjective product rather than an objective reality, we cannot meaningfully talk about self-control or any of the other virtues that make us fully human. Okay, well here endeth the first philosophical half. Now we seek to apply some of these notions to education and schooling, and I shall start with a little story. So I hope you're all sitting comfortably from the silver chair, one of the Narnia stories. So, and the way Lewis satirises the leadership of Experiment House in the silver chair is really witty. He says, I shall say as little as possible about Jill's school, which is not a pleasant subject. It is a mixed school for boys and girls, but not so mixed as the minds of the people who ran it. These people had the idea that boys and girls should be allowed to do what they liked, and unfortunately, what 10 or 15 of the biggest boys and girls liked best was bullying the others. All sorts of things, horrid things, went on, which at an ordinary school would have been found out and stopped in half a term. But at this school they weren't. Or even if they were, the people who did them were not expelled or punished. It sounds strangely modern. Schools now, did you know this? Schools now face serious penalties if they exclude badly behaved children. It's not taken to be a sign of running a tight ship or having good discipline. It's taken as a sign of the failure of the teachers and the school leaders. So that mustn't really be done anymore. And head teachers get this sort of advice. In addressing inappropriate behaviour, you should always make it clear that it is the behaviour and not the person you are critical of. Sounds familiar? Behaviour Management pocketbook. Fits nicely in a dark blue suit. Now, that militates against an honest appraisal of character, doesn't it? And one's character, if we separate the behaviour from the person. It's certainly, am I what?
Yeah, it's gone.
Certainly, let's swap it. Okay. Right, back on. It certainly doesn't exercise the chest. Okay. Now, where does this all come from? The focus on behaviour. I want to suggest to you that it's influenced by B.F. Skinner's behaviourism. Okay, we get positive behaviour strategies and assertive discipline techniques, such as cantors in schools. Skinner did experiments with rats, operant conditioning. You know, the relation between behaviour and consequences. If you do this, you get some food, like Pavlov's dogs. You know, the lab assistant turns up and the dogs start to salivate because they think they're going to get some food. The quip is usually made that most of Skinner's research was done on animals such as rats, and most of his pronouncements are about children, not people. There is actually a serious point there, that young people are endowed with the capacity to discern far more than positive or negative associations. Okay, so even the schools that are far more efficient and far more effective than the headed experiment house, by focusing on behaviour and behaviour management rather than the character of the child, are doing the child a disservice. Okay. In opposition to Skinner's view, Lewis states that humans are more than animals because we have a chest, we have a moral sense, we can cultivate just sentiments. We're more than reason, we have more than appetites. Okay, now, look, let's add to that. Let's add to that situation the fact that many teachers currently find subscribing to any set of values deeply problematic. They say, I have children from so many different homes, so many different backgrounds in front of me, what can I possibly teach without opening a whole can of worms? I think I'm cutting in and out.
Yeah, I think that battery's in.
That one might be going as well, but we've got more batteries in this one. So.
Okay, third mic. Excellent. Thank you. Okay. So they commit themselves to a sort of undefined humanism, where the question is one of personal feeling only. This is what Karen Bolin says. Our temptation as educators of adolescents in an increasingly pluralistic society is to remain hands-off and assume a non-interference policy when it comes to the topic of moral choices and commitments. We are sometimes inclined to leave older children free to discover for themselves what is best and right. But of course, when educators decide that morality should be relegated to the private realm, the pushers of pornography and other antisocial vices proselytise them in a much larger, much more pervasive scale. They are unrelenting in their efforts to pump their messages into the mainstream via internet, billboards, television. Okay. There are serious problems with subjectivity when it comes to schooling, and especially the education of character. So a girl was taught that values are subjective opinions. This is the issue that Lewis objected to in The Abolition of Man when he was reviewing the Green Book. The mother asks her daughter if slavery is wrong. Her response is, I think slavery is wrong, but that is just my opinion. No absolutes. Lewis hoped that real mothers and real children would preserve the sanity of the human race, and said that thus far educationists had achieved very little by comparison. I mentioned training earlier. Aristotelian virtue ethics is influential now, and really echoed in Lewis in some degree. Lewis says, what you mean by a good tennis player is the man whose eye and muscles and nerves have been so trained by making innumerable good shots that they can now be relied upon. But of course there's this retreat from any kind of training because of the fear among professional educators of indoctrination. The real mothers and fathers, if they're not absentee, don't have a problem with training. The professional educators do, because they fear being branded as indoctrinators. But of course a doctrine is a truth. And all schools lead children into truths, into particular truths, whether they're humanist or materialist or atheist or whatever, they lead children into particular truths. So we are all indoctrinators, not perhaps in the pejorative North Korean sense, but all schools seek to change the hearts and the minds of children. We know that much. Okay. So, parents, families. He was a staunch defender of liberty and defended the right of an individual to live his own life, to live life in his own way, to call his house his castle, to enjoy the fruits of his own labour, to educate his children as his conscience directs. And I want to warmly commend to you the work of Tom Lacona, Character Matters. Character education is the deliberate effort to cultivate virtue, which is influential in public, that is state schools in the US. And he's here at the Birmingham University Jubilee Centre for Character and Values later this month. Lewis said, this relates to the previous talk about whether we think too highly or too lowly of ourselves. Lewis said, make some serious attempt to practice the Christian virtues. A week won't do, try 6 weeks. By that time, one will have discovered some truths about oneself. I confess, I don't need 6 weeks. Okay. So, right, current issues, the abolition of man. The parallel text almost to the abolition of man is that hideous strength. The third in the Ransom trilogy, the science fiction trilogy, but not the space trilogy. Lewis did not believe in space, referred to the heavens. Okay, but it's his science fiction trilogy. And a lot of the points that are made in the abolition of man are illustrated in that hideous strength. He wrote just before the end of the Second World War, and he describes ways of living on another planet that are not dissimilar in important respects to some patterns of behaviour that we're witnessing today with regard to pornography. He describes a planet, Dr. Elwyn Ransom describes a planet on which there are cold marriages. There are cold marriages because of devotion to images rather than a real spouse. On the planet Solva, there dwell an accursed people full of pride and lust. There, when a young man takes a maiden in marriage, they do not lie together, but each lies with a cunningly fashioned image of the other, made to move and to be worn by devilish arts. For real flesh will not please them. They are so dainty in their dreams of lust. And Lewis might be regarded as prophetic. We need to protect children and young people from these devilish arts. Pornography poses a serious threat to marriage in particular, but to relationships more generally. This people shares our curse. And reading of the marriage of Mark and Jane Studdock in that hideous strength is well worthwhile. This people shares our curse. While I was writing the chapter on sex education for the book, I was on the train on the way to Leeds to work, and I read the harrowing story of a boy who had committed a rape after viewing hardcore pornography that he'd viewed on the internet. And he had acted out what he had seen on an explicit pornographic website. And the court was told that this may well be the tip of the iceberg, because young people of the current generation of teenagers are growing up with a skewed view of what sex is and sexual activity. According to the judge, Lady Anne Smith, you should not and must not regard pornography as any guide at all as to how to behave sexually. Bailey reports findings, research findings, The children became convinced that they had to behave and look like the on-screen participants in order to have proper sex, which generally meant sexual intercourse without any basis of love or display of affection. I put it to you that many schools and homes are not educating children and young people about the dangers of addiction to pornography, the threat that it poses to well-being. That of all the research projects carried out, we could do with knowing what schools are teaching their young people about how to behave morally online. Lewis says, the chapter on sex education in the book is subtitled Self-Control and Sales Resistance. He says, an emphasis on self-control and moral behaviour. Sorry, he didn't say that. He says nature, in the sense of natural desire, will have to be controlled unless you are going to ruin your whole life. Okay. I was in a classroom in Bradford, a very multicultural classroom, observing a lesson on Romeo and Juliet, and the teacher, it betrayed some very secular assumptions. The teacher explained to the class that relationships were quite different back then, in Romeo and Juliet's time, Shakespeare's time. People waited until they were married to have sexual relations, and that's completely different to what we do now, all of us. The message was that waiting until one is married to have sexual relations would be something of an anachronism. I could see some Muslim girls with headscarves in the class, and I knew that their communities would not agree with that. From evangelicals to Catholics, I couldn't recognise them. There were no identifiers, but I knew their communities would not agree with that either. The same school, I passed a notice board. I have to really trust my boyfriend. I'm not going to feel pressured into sex before I'm ready. Not a single reference to marriage. It might be considered to betray a certain bias. You know, Roger Scruton talks about shamelessness and a generation growing up without shame, which seems salient here. The assumption underlying much sex ed in schools is that many young people will have sexual relations, and so it's confined to a health and safety program. And not educating, as Lewis would say, the character or the chest. Okay. Just winding up now. For C.S. Lewis, marriage could only be between a man and a woman. Yet in some primary schools, children are now encouraged to read books where a child has two mums or two dads in order to promote homosexuality as an acceptable alternative lifestyle. Okay, I want us to imagine for a moment, C.S. Lewis as a school teacher in 21st century England, and to consider how accommodating our society might be to his traditional Christian views. It's not entirely fanciful. He might well have become a schoolmaster if he'd not been appointed to a supply job, a 1-year temporary tutor in philosophy at Magdalen College, Oxford. So he got his first job for a year. Well, let's imagine Jack, as his friends knew him, sitting around the coffee table on a Friday, looking at the Times educational supplement, which he rarely reads. On this particular Friday, the headline reads, "Teachers must promote diversity." There's been yet another code of conduct for teachers, requiring them to promote diversity. The article notes that this could have the effect of forcing them to choose between their profession and their conscience. So here we see the state determining what is good or bad. Let's think back to the first part of the lecture about objective truth, objective value, the Tao, the sheet of music needing to tell the keys the notes to play, not one of the keys telling the keys the notes to play. To the image of New York, whether we love the Big Apple or we hate the Big Apple, it is there, it exists. We don't say to people, don't impose your law of gravity on me. It's universal. And here we see the state determining what is good or bad, or a morality determined by majority vote, which is influenced by the media. So Lewis foresees, writing in 1943 in The Abolition of Man, he foresees an education where judgments of value are to be produced in the pupil as part of the conditioning. He sees an educational elite or an establishment as the conditioners. Whatever Tao there is will be the product, not the motive of education. The conditioners have been emancipated from all that. Good and bad applied to them are words without content, for it is from them that the content of these words is henceforward to be derived. He foresaw the man-moulders of the new age, the powers of an omnicompetent state. Stepping outside the Tao, they have stepped into the void, nor are their subjects necessarily unhappy men. They are not men at all, they are artifacts. Man's final conquest has proved to be the abolition of man.